LVMH, the largest French stock, was for 3 years the largest company in Europe in terms of capitalization, and it alone weighs more than 15% of the French index. But this company, which had only known the glory and prosperity for 30 years, has lost 25% of its value over the last 6 months, which is one of the sharpest declines in its history. So you are going to tell me that LVMH fell several times in similar proportions, and that is true, but they were less serious declines since it was part of a context of generalized fall in the financial markets. The crack of COVID, for example, the 2008 crisis, or the rise in interest rates 2022, periods where LVMH actually lost more than 25% of its value, but it suffered its decline simply by following the market, which is much less worrying for the company itself. What is happening is that LVMH is falling quite sharply in a period where the financial markets as a whole are declining a little or stagnating, but over the last 6 months, they have not experienced real financial crises like those that we mentioned previously. This kind of movement under a stock normally means that there is a problem not in the financial markets in general, but that there is a problem specifically with this particular company, a problem which, to justify such a significant drop, must still be quite significant too. The first reason which could explain this drop is a poor third quarter of 2023. But the stock had started to fall well before the results, and a difference of a few percent on the quarterly results does not justify such a significant drop. The results are what we see, but that is not the root of the problem on action. The revaluation does not have LVMH, moreover, but luxury brands in general, since most of them have experienced similar trajectories. And due to a reduction in their growth prospects, the markets no longer believe that LVMH will be able to continue to grow at the same speed as LVMH will be able to continue to have around 20% growth per year. It is quite visible on this graph, for example. Past growth was around 20% per year, and future growth estimated by analysts is around 6% per year, which is very much below and which justifies the drop in valuation that we are currently seeing. The other point which justifies the drop is the end of a cliché, which was the idea that the luxury clientele of LVMH, among others, were rich, that the rich do not experience the crisis, and that there was therefore a sort of disconnection between the economic situation of the general population and the results of luxury companies, which ultimately turns out not to be reality. And these two fund elements which motivate the decline of LVMH have one thing in common, which is the importance of the middle class in the growth and in the results of LVMH. Contrary to popular belief, and according to very recent studies, middle-class consumers represent more than 50% of sales in the luxury market. And on top of that, they account for the majority of sales growth. The luxury clientele is generally divided into 2 blocks. We will actually have 5% of the most active consumers who will spend up to $43,000 per year in the United States. So absolutely enormous expenses, which are equivalent to almost 40% of sales. But then you will have the vast majority of customers who earn less than $75,000 per year, which may not be much, but in the United States, with an average salary of $60,000 per year, earning less than $75,000 per year is pretty much middle class. So this middle class will spend around $2,200 or less per year, so it's relatively little compared to the high rollers we saw before. But as there are very many of them, as they represent the vast majority of customers, well, this middle class ultimately corresponds to more than 50% of group sales. The very high growth that we have experienced recently in terms of luxury has been driven precisely by this ever-increasing middle class, which has spent its excess income linked to COVID savings, in particular on luxury products. This dependence on the middle class for growth means that we end up not with a counter-cyclical company that would perform very well during periods of crisis because its customers, supposedly very rich, would retain enormous purchasing power, but with, on the contrary, a company which draws the majority of its growth from the existence of income generated by the middle classes, who, when they have income that exceeds their expenses, treat themselves with a purchase of a Louis Vuitton bag or Balenciaga sneaker. Except that this excess income, in a context like today, with very high inflation and relatively low economic growth, decreases drastically, and therefore the middle class will cut the most unnecessary expenses. And what is more useless than spending 2,000 euros on a sweater or jeans? Well, not much, unfortunately. So the correlation between household income and luxury profits, which one might have thought to be weak, is in reality extremely important, and is probably the main factor macroeconomic which will determine the group's growth. Overall, we will have the number of multimillionaires in the super rich on a global scale as a determining factor in the growth of luxury, and as a second factor, what we could call the budgetary surplus of the middle classes throughout the world. It is really these two figures which will determine the performance of luxury in general in the world. And from there, we can take a fresh look at the third quarter results. In a context where the European, American, and even Chinese middle class is currently experiencing a difficult period in terms of purchasing power. Due to inflation, among other things, it seems almost quite surprising that they continue to spend a quite significant amount of money in luxury. One could have assumed, for example, in the current context, that the 50% of sales linked to the middle class would have been drastically reduced compared to 2022, which was a very good year for LVMH. Once again, we are talking about luxury spending, which could not be more dispensable, but no, they still managed to maintain quite honorable growth of around 14% organically, which is indeed lower than usual, but which still remains very good in this unfavorable macroeconomic context. Honestly, we could have imagined much worse results, especially when we take into account that the luxury faces competition at the second-hand level of resale of luxury items. And as you can see in this graph, which talks about watches, but we suppose that it is quite similar for luxury products in general, the selling price of second-hand luxury items has fallen significantly since 2022. And therefore, LVMH customers with a reduced budget could have found the same items at prices quite significantly cheaper second-hand. But no, they have still continued to spend money going to stores, and this still shows the attachment that customers have to the different brands that make up the group. In addition to that, the company retains defensive qualities which are all the same very appreciable currently. In particular, a debt which is extremely low in relation to the assets that the company owns. A debt which is almost non-existent in reality. Luxury still remains a very interesting business. The fact of selling bags or products 10 times above the cost price of the bag, that remains something very interesting, which allows for enormous budgetary flexibility. Well, the financial windfall generated by the group could currently be used in this somewhat particular context to make intelligent buyouts of companies in difficulty, which could further expand the group's portfolio and thus increase the group's growth if the situation macroeconomic is restored. In conclusion, we will define three visions of the LVMH situation, which will explain how everyone can position themselves in relation to LVMH stock and in relation to the luxury market in general. The first idea is to think that the luxury boom of the 2000s is over, that it is a weariness, a decline in consumer appetite for this type of product, and that this is what caused these bad results. We could therefore enter a phase where luxury would grow at the same speed as other industries, between 5 and 10% per year, which is indeed a completely realistic point of view, and which is a point of view which is quite shared on the financial markets currently, with in particular the Financial Times, which interviewed articles in particular, which demonstrated that many sector analysts believe quite a bit in this scenario. The second scenario that we will have is to say that the slowdown in sales is due to the decline, or at least the slight acceleration in the purchasing power of the middle classes throughout the world, which was precisely what was pushing sales of luxury in recent years. But this second vision, which remains rather pessimistic, will think that the purchasing power of the middle classes throughout the world will remain quite low and will not increase much in the coming years, and that therefore the growth of the group in the medium term will remain relatively low, once again between 5 and 10% per year. Growth that is entirely correct, but which does not necessarily justify a valuation as high as that which LVMH would like to have. And the third vision, the rather optimistic scenario, is to say that the slowdown in sales actually comes from the crisis in purchasing power, and not from a weariness of luxury in itself, but that, contrary to hypothesis 2, the power of purchasing by the middle classes could rise fairly quickly after this period of inflation and economic slowdown, which would allow LVMH sales growth to increase to around 15–20% as before, which would justify a return to a higher valuation. Then at staff, my opinion, which is worthless, is rather scenario 3, But it is true that we can understand that the market today is rather hesitant between scenario 1 and 2 because to be in favor of scenario 3, you need everything. Likewise, be quite optimistic and ignore a little the various current economic and geopolitical problems, which is very complicated if you watch television or if you follow the media. And then even fairly optimistic people, I think, do not see an explosion of power of middle-class purchases in the fourth quarter of 2023 or even in the first quarter of 2024, which gives a fairly strong short-term advantage or a slightly more negative vision. So obviously be careful to what you are doing in terms of increase. It is only the fruit of my analyses and my readings, but which is not worth much. The LVMH share can still fall in this macroeconomic context, and in any case, all the shares can always reach zero. But in the same way, I think that we should not panic either. LVMH still maintains an extremely solid financial balance sheet. Of course, there is a slight slowdown, but which I think is entirely explainable, and which does not justify panic, particularly around the LVMH title. In any case, it's my opinion here. The video is finished. If you want to discuss the action, I would be delighted to know what is the vision you have around the action, and here you go. Subscribe. It helps me a lot. And don't forget to watch my other videos. Thank you.